Good afternoon. This often is a difficult slot just after lunch, but we're going to excite you a little bit by challenging you about issues relating to franchise agreements. And I'm sure you all think that legal subjects are dry. Well, I hope to bring a bit of life to this, and we have on our panel from the firm of Nishith Desai, the founder of the firm, right, and his senior colleague. The law firm that Nishith represents operates around the globe and is one of the most experienced Indian law firms and indeed international law firms in this area of franchising and tax. And so I think we'll be very well served, very well served. So let's get started, and I think here we go. I think I start with a fairly contentious saying, and this is not to in any way denigrate our law firm, but to understand very clearly that franchising is not a legal process, right? And the legal process in franchising is a subset of the commercial process, not the other way round. In other words, there is little value going to a lawyer until you've developed your actual business model. And so get your commercial model right and then build your legal framework around it. And as we'll discuss, and we'll talk about today, and we'll have questions a little later, this is all about building a robust business model, and then the legal framework will protect not only your intellectual property, but the way in which you conduct business on an ongoing basis. And so we were asked to address a few situations here, and the first of those, I'm not sure if this is actually working, so if we could go on to the next slide. And the next slide, that's it. Interests, values and needs of the parties in a franchise dispute. I think that before we leap into this question of let's litigate with a franchise owner, let's ask the question, how did we get here? How did you get into a dispute with your franchise owner? And what sort of lessons can you learn from it? Because in any dispute, there's obviously two parties, and it's very, very critical to have a dispute resolution process. Both you and your franchise owners need to understand the process. And my legal colleagues will talk a little bit about this in a moment. In other words, what are the expectations? Do you have within your documentation a dispute resolution process, and how is it triggered? We see in many markets around the world now specific franchising laws that dictate a dispute resolution process. So ensure you have it in your documentation. I think it's very important as well that not only you be heard, but your franchise owner be heard and their views respected. You may not agree with them, but they're where they are because they're in your system. And you chose and you recruited those franchise owners. So ask yourself the question, would you want to be heard in this forum of dispute resolution? I think it's also very important to have both of the parties in the dispute understand what their hoped-for outcomes are. To arrive at a dispute resolution process saying that I'm unhappy and I want justice isn't good enough. What you need to understand is what specifically you're looking for that can resolve this and go on. Because we see in franchising that a lot of angst is driven between the franchisor wanting to control the franchisee or the franchisee wanting to control the franchisor, when in fact it's both parties' responsibilities to preserve the brand and the customer experience. And so in this way, having a collaborative outcome of how you wanted to resolve the dispute and go on with the relationship is very critical. You also need to be prepared to compromise. The reality is life isn't perfect, and unless you can come to the table totally hands clean and blameless, let's look on the other side of this dispute and where you wish to be. Your franchise owners will spend the best part of 5 to 10 years of their life and probably their life savings invested in your business. And so there is life after a dispute, and you need to think about your conduct so that you can have a relationship after that dispute. And also it's very, very important. I can guarantee there is not a franchisor in this room or indeed in the world, and even August franchisors that have been in the business for a long time like Pepsi, I'm sure have disputes with their franchise owners. Right? What I'm saying is each dispute has got the seeds of a learning in it that you won't repeat again. And so if you have disputes, a post-mortem with your executive team, or maybe if you have a franchise advisory council with them, and ask the question of yourself, what could have we done differently to prevent this situation? Could we have seen the problem earlier? So I'd like now to defer to my legal colleagues, and you might make some comments in terms of this slide.
Thank you so much, Rod. By the way, my name is Nishith Desai. I'm the founder of Nishith Desai Associates, and we have offices around the world. We've seen a lot of, developments in the last 25, 30 years. India has come of age to some extent now. First point you made was very relevant, that focus more on business model, the strategy. And law and tax are only tools to achieve your strategic objectives. Don't get over involved in the legalities to start with. What you want to make sure is there are some non-negotiable, you want to sit on that, some negotiable and some giveaways. I think fundamentally that is very relevant. Otherwise you'll be having so many different kind of situations that you get in. From the perspective of the evolution, we have seen a lot of products, kind of franchises coming up, but as far as India itself is concerned, the domestic skill set, I would say, we will be doing better and better on the services. India is already about 57–60% services or maybe more, and we believe that there is great opportunity in India to develop services and develop franchises. So franchisers, service franchisers from India would be a very interesting way to look at. And as you see, third thing that's happening, I see around the world, and we have particularly office in Silicon Valley, and from products to services to platformers. So today it's platformers who build more value. And therefore, third category, that's if you see all the Facebooks of the world, or the LinkedIns of the world, or other ones, they are all platforms, okay? And in India also, you see marketplace is doing great job, then many other kind of products or services. I'm not saying others are not doing, but we need to understand how the trends are, and I think that these are all three opportunities exist in front of us. And when it comes to relationship between franchisor and franchisee, it's as was said in the previous panel, is the relationship that matters very much. In India, due diligence becomes very, very critical, and due diligence not in terms of financial wherewithals. I think people have a lot of money at times. People have a lot of infrastructure, where the missing link is a value system, okay? And when I say value system, not that everything, but I think the kind of practices, corrupt practices or other kind of issues there, the sensitivity is not there. Harassment, for example, is in many places still a non-issue, okay, just coming up. And it is very important to understand, if you're a franchisor, to know who the franchisee is, and of course, franchisee has to understand franchisors' expectations and what they are actually, what is their business model, how they drive value by using your facility here. So I think that is what is very, very important. And you know, when it comes to dispute, first thing I recommend, don't just jump into the court, because court process in India could take, you know, how many years? Somebody can tell me? Okay. How many? Whatever, right? So why? Because if you can't finish a litigation this life, we believe in reincarnation. So we can have it next life. So I think litigation, of course, now there is some change happening and visible change that's happening. But it's very important to avoid going to the court as much as possible. Resolve your problems, mediation, conciliation, arbitration. I actually sit on the board of Singapore International Arbitration Center. I know maximum number of cases from outside Singapore are now being referred to from India. So India has become a big market for Singapore as well. And main reason is that you can resolve disputes now. There are a lot of innovation even in that particular area. So these are my initial comments that, you know, you understand it's easy to serve a notice, easy to get into litigation, and we lawyers are expert in pushing you into litigation. But I think once you get in, it's very difficult to get out of the relationship. So even though I'm talking against my own interest, I would recommend that first try to resolve your problem by talking it over, get somebody to mediate, somebody to reconcile your situation, and go on. I don't want to overstep at this point in time, but we'll deal with that.
They're very valuable points. And just on that point in Singapore, Singapore has been used as a centre for arbitration and dispute resolution for many years, and we see international franchise agreements name Singapore as the place for mediation, especially in bigger networks. So if we move on to the new generation of IP challenges from digital media, and this has been a real minefield for franchise owners. How many people here have franchisees with their own Facebook pages? Right, there's only a few hands up, but I can guarantee you, if you go and look on Facebook, you will find almost all of your franchisees have a Facebook page with your brand mentioned on it somewhere. And I see this as a big issue that you need to address and need to address in your documentation. Domain name hijacking is almost a sport. And we see it around the world. Brands that are emerging in one market find that somebody is sitting on their domain names in other markets. And you might mention some of the remedies here from a legal point of view, but the process is painful. Your brand names turn up in competitors' paid searches. So why is it that when you go looking for your website, you find you're landing on your competitor's page? It's because they're actually hijacking your name and using it in paid search terms. The challenges of multiple websites, your own franchise owners' websites or your websites around the world. And so you find consumers are looking at the message of what your story is presented across the world. And if you have big market opportunities for your brand or your product in markets like the US especially, or in Europe, the opportunity to have your web page there is really valuable. So who owns it? Who's sitting on it? I recently worked with a client who spent $250,000 US to buy their trademark back, and I predict as things go forward, we're going to see more and more costs involved in protecting our IP and digital media. Hacking and website corruption needs to be managed. Look-alike frauds that look like your site but take you to another location and divert your customers are an issue, and of course denial of service. So I just want to give you the tip of that iceberg of issues that you need to address And I don't say this with any despair. I simply say these are realities of the digital world, and we need to be thinking about these when we're preparing our franchise agreements and when we're providing a guidance for our franchise owners in what they can and can't do. So I might defer again to you.
Yeah, I think all of us know today that I think digital media is extremely powerful medium. And no longer you protest on the streets. I think you protest actually on the digital media. And reputational risk, I think, is at stake every single morning. I think CEO or chairman or, everybody is more worried about what will appear on the front page of newspapers today than acquiring one more customer, And it's become a very tricky situation. So even as lawyers, our role has become more of managing that reputational risk. Even every press note, anything you say, often needs to be run through a lawyer. And because you don't know how you get trapped and how you can be interpreted. 17-second video in Egypt changed the whole destiny of the country. And that's one of the things. Maybe Ananth, he's my colleague and leads our franchise practice out of Delhi office, may have a few words to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nishith Bhai. Thank you, Rod. So, as I said at the beginning, we don't have a law for franchise, for the franchise industry. But if you look at indicators for ease of doing business in India or ease of doing business anywhere, as articulated by the World Bank, enforceability of contracts is one of them. And I think fundamentally what you look for is enforceability of contracts in relation to franchisor, franchisee. And the second thing is, of course, intellectual property rights. Protection of intellectual property rights is something which is seen as being linked to the rule of law. And so it is very important that parties preserve their intellectual property rights. Whereas in India, we believe culturally and historically, we've had this belief that everything belongs to everyone. So if you take the myths, the mythologies and all of that, everyone has an interpretation of it. Even the samosa, there is an interpretation of samosa in the north. There's a different version in Bombay. Chaat is like that. So we have not, we don't associate intellectual property right with commercial aspects, but over a period of time, I think we have grown to live with it, respect it, and also enforce it. So our courts have been very receptive to this. And issues that we have faced, I'd just like to touch upon a couple of issues which Rod had mentioned. One is regulatory risk. Today we don't have that much litigation between a franchisor and a franchisee. But what we do have are issues of compliance either under competition law or indirect taxes. These tend to be tricky areas where some regulator or an enforcement agency will try to fasten liability on, say, the franchisor because, for various reasons, it is easier to target a franchisor rather than go behind individual franchisees. So there are various circumstances where franchisors should be aware of their rights and their obligations and how they are to be protected.
I think that's very true, that often the relationships get spoiled because of the regulatory agencies and the tax department, particularly on tax. All of you know that most of the foreign companies, 70% of the major companies, they are all into litigation. Mm-hmm. And regulations are written in slightly, unfriendly way or not a very clear way. So what happens? Franchisor will understand his responsibility one way, and the franchisor will understand this different way. And then problems come up because who is responsible and what's happening, and this is not my control. So I think we just need to be very careful as to how, but one needs to be on the top of what's happening every morning. I think in India changes every morning these days, So over to you.
Right. It reinforces again the importance of being clear in what you want to achieve in terms of the management of your IP, and then get the advice once you've developed your strategy of what you want to do. And if you think good advice is expensive, just think about how costly bad advice is.